Well, hello there. This is Pastor Dan with First Alliance Church. It's a pleasure to be with you today. This is our Friday devotional. Today, our devotional is brought to you by Vermont Pure Maple Syrup. Vermont Pure Maple Syrup is made from the very best maple trees that you could ever possibly find up in the great state of Vermont. It comes in amber and light amber and super great amber, and just the purest, most delicious, wonderful thing. It is 10 times better than log cabin. See, log cabin syrup is kind of made from all the other kind of stuffs. Corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, regular old sugar corn syrup. But it is not high-grade Vermont pure maple syrup because it can't be, because it's made out of something else. You say, what in the world is Pastor Dan talking about? When it comes to our sanctification, our object is to look like our Maker, because we have now become children of God. When we were converted out of our old life into our new life, it doesn't necessarily mean that we stop being the people we were. It just means that we start living by a different code, a different set of values. And when we're trying to live by a different set of values, well, sometimes that's difficult. And we find ourselves wanting to overcome sin, which is part of sanctification. So I asked myself the question, Dan, how do I overcome sin? Well, what do you do to overcome sin? Well, you try not to do it, right? Well, I mean, sometimes you try not to do it. Sometimes you just find yourself trapped by it. But, I mean, really, how do you try to overcome sin? Well, I think we find the solution in Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. Let's see what it has to say. It says, those who live according to the sinful nature have their mind set on what that nature desires. So if you're having trouble with sinful behavior, it's because you think too much about that sinful behavior. You think too much about how to make room for it, how to try it out, how to get away with it, how to figure it out, how to savor it. Now, I know sometimes that sinful behavior isn't all that savory. Like if we're trapped in bitterness or pride or anger, we don't necessarily savor those things, although sometimes we do. But we still get trapped there, and we think too much about situations that relate to those circumstances. And that doesn't help us move beyond those things. So let's see what else he says. Those who live according to sinful nature, this is verse 5, chapter 8, Romans 8, have their mind set on what that nature desires. But those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their mind set on the Spirit desires. So what you set your mind on influences what you decide to do. Now, what did Jesus set his mind on? He said, I want to do the things I see the Father doing, and I'm here to honor the Father. So he had in mind the things of God. You could say, well, he is God, and I guess that makes it easier for him. But at the same time, he also had all the distractions that we have. I mean, he had to eat, he had to travel around, he had people who depended on him, he had people who he depended on. So he had a lot of circumstances. He had people who didn't like him. He had people that made life hard on him. He was pursued by people for their own selfish ends. So it wasn't so easy. But I think he embodied what it means to set your mind on things above. Verse 6, the mind of sinful man is death, but the mind controlled by the Spirit is life and peace. If you want more life and peace, you have to start having your mind controlled by the Spirit. That's the Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of our sanctifier, Christ. The mind of sinful man is death, the mind controlled by the Spirit is life and peace. The sinful mind is hostile to God, does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those controlled by the sinful nature cannot please God. If you want to please God, you have to stop being controlled by the old nature. That means you have to set your mind on something else. You, however, verse 9, are controlled not by the sin nature, but by the Spirit. If the Spirit of God lives in you, and if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he does not belong to Christ. But if Christ is in you, your body is dead because of sin. Your spirit is alive because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who lives in you. So there's a relationship between your ability to overcome sin and having the Spirit live in you. Are you making room for the Spirit of God to influence you? Are you picking up the Scriptures and reading it? Are you talking to the Lord about your life and trouble? Have you set your mind on things above and not on things on this earth? Now, what are things above? Well, they're things that God cares about. God cares about your neighbor. God cares about your family members. God cares about grace and mercy and compassion. God cares about truth. But you have to do it with truth and love together. Truth by itself can be an awful, terrible thing. And we don't wield it carefully enough. So truth and mercy have to go hand in hand. And then there's always showing compassion to those around us who struggle. There's also forgiveness, gentleness. Well, you can look at the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. You can also look at Romans 12. You're looking for a list of things that we're to be as people who are sanctified people. It says love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good, be devoted to one another in brotherly love, have zeal, serve the Lord, joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer, share with God's people who are in need, practice hospitality. These are just a few things. There are a whole nother 8 or 9 verses that talk about other things that we can do if we're setting our minds above. I think one of the key things to set our minds above is to remember what's pure and virtuous. Think on these things. Because there's a big difference between maple syrup and log cabin. And if I have the preference, I'm going to pick maple syrup because it is the real deal. If you set your minds on things above, you'll find that the things that God talks about are the real deal. We're in Romans chapter 8. We're going to talk this Sunday about what do we do with the sin in our lives if we're supposed to be sanctified. If we're called to be sanctified people, set apart. Where does righteousness and holiness where does righteousness fit into our sanctification? It influences what we do and why we do it. So we can look more like, well, the real thing. This is Pastor Dan, First Lines Church. First Lines Church is a great place to be. God bless.